Total war doctrine. By 1945, the traditional battlefield had simply ceased to exist. To understand the silence before the blast, you have to look at the chilling math of total war. In this era, there was no such thing as a civilian city. Every factory, every assembly line, and every urban worker was a vital tooth in the gears of the Japanese military machine. The United States didn't view Hiroshima as a residential hub. They saw it as a massive, functional military storage and strategic assembly point that had to be erased. The precedent for destruction without notice was already set. Long before the first atomic flash, American firebombing campaigns had already turned more than 60 Japanese cities into ash. On the night of March 9, 1945, a swarm of B-29s incinerated 16 square miles of Tokyo in a single evening. The resulting firestorm claimed more lives than the atomic blasts that followed weeks later. For American planners, the atomic bomb wasn't a sudden lapse in morality. It was an evolution. A more efficient way to achieve an old goal, breaking the enemy's will by any means necessary. Target committee selection. The choice of Hiroshima wasn't accidental. It was a cold, scientific calculation. The target committee specifically sought out virgin targets, cities that had been spared from previous firebombing raids to ensure a clean slate. Why? Because the United States military needed an undisturbed urban environment to measure the weapon's true, unadulterated destructive power. They weren't just looking for a tactical target, they were looking for a perfect laboratory. Hiroshima, with its unique bowl-shaped geography, was the ideal candidate for this dark experiment. Surrounded by steep hills on three sides, the city's terrain acted like a giant parabolic mirror. When the blast occurred, the surrounding heights didn't let the energy dissipate into the atmosphere. Instead, they reflected the massive shockwave right back toward the center of the city, intensifying the heat and pressure to an unimaginable degree. Had the U.S. issued a specific warning, allowing the population to evacuate, the scientists would have lost their only chance to observe the weapon's maximum destruction radius in a controlled, populated environment. The survival of the city's residents was weighed against the military's hunger for perfect experimental data. And the data won. To the planners, a warned target was a wasted scientific opportunity. Manhattan Project secrecy. Then there was the secret itself, a $2 billion gamble operating in total, suffocating darkness. That's over $30 billion today, spent on a weapon most of the government didn't even know existed. The paranoia was absolute. Think about this. Harry Truman, while serving as Vice President of the United States, was never told the bomb was being built. It wasn't until he was sworn in as president, following Roosevelt's sudden death, that he was finally pulled aside and briefed on the most terrifying weapon in human history. The project employed 130,000 people, but the walls between departments were impenetrable. Even the wives of the top-tier scientists had no idea what their husbands were designing in those hidden labs. Every scrap of paper was guarded by men with guns. Every private conversation was a potential leak. In an environment this volatile, a specific warning to Japan wasn't just a courtesy. It was a catastrophic security breach. To tip their hand early would risk exposing the crown jewel of American engineering to Stalin's vast predatory network of spies. The U.S. government chose to keep the world blind until the very second of detonation because, in their eyes, the secret was just as powerful as the bomb itself. Military surprise. The success of the mission relied on a gamble that sounds suicidal by modern standards. The Enola Gay flew almost entirely alone. This silver B-29 superfortress carried the 9,700-pound Little Boy bomb at an altitude of 31,000 feet without a single fighter escort to protect it from Japanese Zeros. Why take such a massive risk? It was a calculated play on Japanese complacency. By sending only a tiny group of planes, the Americans ensured the formation looked like a routine weather reconnaissance flight or a minor scouting mission, something the Japanese air defenses, depleted and weary, might not waste their precious remaining fuel to intercept. If a specific warning had been issued, this illusion would have shattered instantly. The Japanese military could have scrambled their elite kamikaze units for a desperate mid-air collision to bring the bomber down. But there was a darker possibility that haunted American planners: the use of human shields. If Japan knew exactly where and when the strike was coming, they could have moved thousands of Allied prisoners of war from nearby camps directly into the heart of Hiroshima. The silence wasn't just about stealth, it was to prevent the enemy from using American lives to stop an American bomb. The Potsdam Declaration. On July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued a final ultimatum that would become the legal and moral foundation for the atomic age: the Potsdam Declaration. To the world, it looked like a clear choice for Japan: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. American leaders viewed this document as their final definitive warning. However, there was a strategic, almost surgical silence within the text itself. Not once did the declaration mention the words atomic, nuclear, or the existence of a weapon that could erase a city in a heartbeat. This omission was a deliberate legal trap set by American strategists. By offering a vague but terrifying threat, they provided Japan with a formal opportunity to end the war while simultaneously concealing the true nature of the destruction to come. They wanted to ensure that when the bomb finally fell, it would appear not as a choice made by men, but as an inevitable, godlike fate that Japan had brought upon itself by ignoring the ultimatum. The vagueness of the Potsdam Declaration ensured that the U.S. could claim the moral high ground for having warned the enemy, while maintaining the absolute shock value needed to force a surrender. It was the last chance, written in a way that guaranteed the secret of the Manhattan Project remained safe until the very last second. The Mokusatsu response. History is often decided by a single word, and in late July 1945, that word was mokusatsu. When the Japanese Prime Minister, Kantaro Suzuki, was pressed by reporters for a reaction to the Potsdam Declaration, he used this specific, ambiguous term. In his mind, and in the context of the fragile Japanese cabinet, he meant to withhold comment or to remain in silent observation while they debated the terms of surrender. He was playing for time, trying to balance the demands of the fanatical military with the reality of looming defeat. However, when the translation reached the desk of President Harry Truman, the nuance was completely lost. U.S. State Department translators rendered mokusatsu as to reject with contempt or to ignore entirely. To the Americans, this wasn't a diplomatic pause. It was a defiant slap in the face. This single linguistic mistranslation effectively slammed the door on any further negotiation. Truman, convinced that Japan had arrogance where there should have been submission, concluded that only a direct, unannounced strike could provide the necessary answer. While Japanese officials were internally arguing over how to end the war, the Americans, misled by a dictionary definition, were already fueling the planes. It was a fatal breakdown in communication that directly signed the death warrant for hundreds of thousands, proving that in the nuclear age, silence is the most dangerous language of all. Failure of the demonstration option. Inside the halls of American power, a frantic debate took place. Why not drop the bomb on a deserted island or a forest to simply show Japan its power? This demonstration option was ultimately rejected because it was a military gamble that the U.S. could not afford to lose. The scientific panel calculated that the risks were astronomical. If the U.S. announced a time and place for a demonstration, the Japanese Air Force could have intercepted the bomber mid-flight, or even worse, Japan could have claimed the entire event was a massive Hollywood-style hoax staged with conventional explosives to trick them into surrendering. But the coldest reality was the math of the arsenal itself. At that moment, the United States only had 2 combat-ready bombs, Little Boy and Fat Man. There was no endless stockpile waiting in the wings. To use one of these precious assets for a mere firework display in the wilderness was seen as a reckless waste of a multi-billion-dollar investment. If the demonstration failed to shock the Japanese military elite, who were already accustomed to seeing their cities burned, the U.S. would have thrown away half of its nuclear leverage for nothing. The decision-makers concluded there was no acceptable alternative to direct military use. They believed the bomb had to fall on a living, breathing city to prove that American power was not just a threat, but a devastating, undeniable reality. Risk of a dud. There was a terrifying technical reality that kept the Manhattan Project's top scientists awake at night, the very real possibility of a dud. In 1945, nuclear technology was in its infancy. It was a volatile collection of theories and unproven equations. While the famous Trinity test in New Mexico had been a success, that was a complex plutonium-based device. The little boy bomb destined for Hiroshima was an entirely different uranium gun design, and it had never been live tested a single time before being loaded onto the Enola Gay. No one could truly guarantee it would actually detonate. This created a massive diplomatic nightmare. If the United States had issued a specific warning announcing the exact time and location of the strike and the bomb failed to explode, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Japan would have laughed at American propaganda. Even worse, they would have recovered the unexploded weapon, gaining access to a nearly priceless core of highly enriched uranium to jumpstart their own nuclear program. American global prestige would have vanished in an afternoon. By remaining silent, the U.S. ensured that if the technology failed, the world would simply never know. Silence was the only insurance policy against a billion-dollar technical embarrassment. Psychological shock. The goal of the unannounced strike wasn't just physical destruction. It was shock and awe on a scale that shattered the human psyche. The Target Committee's secret minutes were explicit. The attack must create a psychological impression deep enough to be recognized by the world. American planners didn't want the Japanese to prepare. They wanted the weapon to appear as an almost supernatural, unstoppable force, as if the Americans could conjure artificial suns from the sky at will. They needed the Japanese high command to believe the U.S. possessed an endless production line of these city killers. This psychological trap worked. In the chaotic days following the Hiroshima blast, frantic rumors swirled through Tokyo that a massive fleet of B-29s, all carrying atomic weapons, was already waiting to erase every remaining city on the map. But the cold reality was much more desperate. The American nuclear arsenal was almost entirely depleted after the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The U.S. was essentially out of ammo. By hitting hard and hitting without warning, they projected an image of infinite, effortless power they didn't actually possess yet. They traded on a massive bluff of total annihilation, forcing a surrender before the world realized they were down to their very last few cards. The Soviet factor. While the world focused on the Pacific, American leaders were looking nervously toward Moscow. This was a race against time, not just against Japanese resistance, but against Joseph Stalin's ambitions. The Soviet Union had pledged to enter the war against Japan by August 8, 1945. The United States feared that if the war dragged on, Soviet troops would seize vast territories in Asia, leading to a partitioned Japan similar to the divided fate of Germany. Ending the war instantly became a geopolitical necessity to keep the Soviet Union off the Japanese mainland. The decision to drop the bombs without warning on August 6th and 9th was a loud, unspoken message directed straight at the Kremlin. It was the first move of the Cold War. By demonstrating the bomb's horrifying power before Stalin could cement his influence in the region, the U.S. secured its position as the sole architect of the post-war order in the Pacific. The lives of the civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, in the cold logic of atomic diplomacy, pawns on a global chessboard. The U.S. didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to win the peace that followed, ensuring that the Red Menace would have no seat at the table in Tokyo. Minimizing American casualties. By the summer of 1945, the U.S. military was staring into a meat grinder called Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Intelligence reports were bone-chilling. Japan had mobilized 28 million civilian militia members. They were armed with everything from bolt-action rifles to sharpened bamboo spears. All were sworn to die for their emperor. Estimates for American casualties were astronomical, up to 1 million dead soldiers. The Pentagon took these numbers so seriously that they took a step that still haunts the military today. In preparation for the expected bloodbath, the U.S. government manufactured 500,000 Purple Heart medals in a single batch. These are the medals awarded to those wounded or killed in combat. The scale of that production was so massive that even after Korea, Vietnam, and 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military is still using the original stock from 1945. Think about that. Every American soldier wounded in the last 80 years is receiving a medal originally intended for someone who would have died invading Japan. Dropping the bomb without warning was seen as the only way to stop a war that was destined to consume an entire generation of American boys. Imperial will. The final reason for the silence was perhaps the most subtle. It was a calculated gift of face for the Japanese emperor. Even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were erased from the map, the Japanese Supreme Council was still paralyzed, split 50-50 on whether to keep fighting to the very last man. The hardline generals didn't care about their cities burning. They had seen that before. But the surprise of the atomic bomb, the fact that it came out of nowhere like a bolt from the heavens, changed the internal political narrative. It allowed Emperor Hirohito to intervene and break the deadlock without admitting that his glorious military had simply been defeated on the battlefield. In his historic radio broadcast to the Japanese people, Hirohito famously declared that Japan would endure the unendurable. Crucially, he blamed the surrender not on a lack of Japanese spirit, but on the fact that the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb with power to destroy innocent lives. This silence from the U.S. provided the emperor with the perfect out. It turned a total military collapse into a humanitarian choice to save the human race from an unnatural weapon. The decision to strike without warning was the final, silent key that unlocked the door to peace, preserving the imperial institution while ending the slaughter of millions. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of history changed how you view the end of World War II, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the archives. Your support allows us to keep digging into the truth. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.